Right now, as you're watching this video, you're probably multitasking. Maybe you have 3 other tabs open. Perhaps you're checking notifications, or mentally planning your next productivity hack. And if that sounds familiar, you're living exactly what Michel Foucault predicted would happen to human beings under modern systems of control, except he wrote about it decades before. Smartphones, before hustle culture, before the word burnout even entered our everyday vocabulary. And today, we're going to explore how one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century saw right through to the heart of what's making millions of people exhausted, anxious, and feeling like they're never doing enough. Michel Foucault wasn't just another French intellectual sitting in a cafe debating abstract ideas. He was a philosopher who spent his life studying how power works, how societies shape human behavior, and most importantly, for our discussion today, how modern institutions don't control us through force or threats, but through something far more subtle and far more effective, something he called disciplinary power. And this concept is the key to understanding why so many people today feel trapped in cycles of endless productivity, constant self-optimization, and ultimately, complete burnout. To understand Foucault's warning about our current predicament, we need to go back to his groundbreaking analysis of how power evolved in Western society, because Foucault noticed that somewhere between the medieval period and the modern era, something fundamental changed about how societies controlled their populations. In the old days, power was visible, brutal, and direct. Kings would execute people in public squares. Torture was a spectacle. Punishment was about making an example. It was what Foucault called sovereign. Power raw and unmistakable. But then something shifted, and instead of controlling people through fear and violence, modern societies discovered something much more efficient. They learned to control people by making them control themselves. This is where Foucault's concept of disciplinary power becomes absolutely crucial to understanding our modern productivity obsession. Because disciplinary power doesn't work by telling you what you can't do. It works by creating systems that make you want to discipline yourself. It creates what Foucault called docile bodies. People who have internalized the rules so completely that they police themselves more effectively than any external authority ever could. And if this sounds familiar, it's because you're living it every single day. Think about your smartphone for a moment. Nobody forces you to check it constantly. There's no law requiring you to respond to emails. Within minutes, no police officer standing over you demanding that you track your steps, optimize your sleep, or measure your productivity, yet you do it anyway, and more importantly, you feel guilty when you don't. You feel anxious when you're not being productive. You feel like you're failing when you're not optimizing some aspect of your life. This is disciplinary power in its purest form. It's so effective that you don't even realize you're being controlled, because the control comes from within. Foucault saw this coming when he studied institutions like prisons, hospitals, schools, and factories. He noticed that all of these places had something in common. They were designed to create self-regulating individuals, people who would monitor their own behavior, judge themselves according to established norms, and constantly work to improve themselves according to external standards that they had internalized as their own desires. The genius of this system is that it makes people feel free while actually constraining them more completely than any dictator ever could. Let's look at how this plays out in our current productivity culture. Because every productivity hack, every life optimization technique, every self-improvement system is essentially a disciplinary mechanism that trains you to become your own supervisor, your own judge, your own prison guard. When you use a habit tracking app, you're not just building habits, you're learning to constantly monitor and evaluate your own behavior when you follow a morning routine. You're not just organizing your day, you're disciplining your body to conform to predetermined patterns. When you measure your output, track your metrics, and optimize your performance, you're turning yourself into what Foucault would recognize as the perfect disciplinary subject. The really insidious part is that this all feels like freedom, feels like self-improvement, feels like taking control of your life. But Foucault would argue that this feeling of control is actually the most sophisticated form of control ever devised. Because when you believe you're freely choosing to optimize yourself, you're actually just executing a program that was designed to make you into a more efficient, more predictable, more manageable human being, and the proof of this is in how miserable it makes you when you can't keep up. This is where we start to see the connection between Foucault's analysis and the burnout epidemic. That S sweeping through modern society, because burnout isn't just about working too hard or having to add much stress. Burnout is what happens when disciplinary power becomes so intense, so internalized, and so inescapable that people literally break down under the weight of constantly monitoring, judging, and trying to optimize themselves. It's the inevitable result of turning human beings into self-managing productivity machines. Foucault understood that disciplinary power creates what he called normalization, a process where people constantly compare themselves to statistical norms and work to eliminate any deviation from the standard. And this is exactly what we see in productivity culture, where everyone is trying to conform to the same idealized version of human efficiency, the same morning routines, the same goal-setting frameworks, the same metrics for success, the same optimization strategies, and anyone who can't keep up feels like a failure, feels broken, feels like they're not trying hard enough. But here's what's particularly brutal about our current situation. The disciplinary mechanisms that Foucault identified in institutions like prisons and factories at least had physical boundaries. When you left work, you left work. When you graduated from school, you were done with school. But in our hyperconnected world, the disciplinary apparatus follows you everywhere. Your phone tracks your steps while you sleep. Your apps monitor your meditation practice. Your smartwatch judges your heart rate variability. Your social media feeds constantly remind you of how other people are optimizing their lives. There is literally no escape from the surveillance and judgment that once was confined to specific institutions. This is why Foucault's analysis is so prophetic. He predicted that disciplinary power would eventually extend beyond institutions to become a generalized social condition, a way of being that people would carry with them wherever they went. And that's exactly what we see today, where the entire social media ecosystem functions as a massive disciplinary apparatus, constantly encouraging people to present optimized versions of themselves, to compare their performance to others, to document their progress, to justify their existence through measurable achievements. The tragedy is that this system promises fulfillment, success, and happiness, but it actually makes these things impossible to achieve. Because disciplinary power is designed to create perpetual dissatisfaction, it needs you to always feel like you're not quite good enough, not quite productive enough, not quite optimized enough, because if you ever felt truly satisfied, truly complete, truly enough, you would stop participating in the system. You would stop buying the products, consuming the content, and engaging with the platforms that depend on your insecurity and dissatisfaction. This is the genius and the horror of what Foucault identified. Modern power doesn't need to oppress you. It just needs to convince you that you're not optimized enough. And you'll oppress yourself more thoroughly than any external force ever could. You'll work longer hours, not because someone forces you to, but because you've internalized the belief that your worth depends on your productivity. You'll sacrifice sleep, relationships, and mental health, not because you have to, but because you've been trained to see these sacrifices as investments in your future optimized self. Foucault also understood that disciplinary power creates what he called examination, a constant process of measurement, comparison, and evaluation that turns every aspect of human experience into data to be analyzed and optimized. And this is exactly what we see in our current culture of quantified self-movement, where people track everything from their sleep cycles to their mood patterns, from their caloric intake to their social interactions, turning their entire existence into a spreadsheet to be optimized. The problem with examination is that it reduces human experience to measurable metrics, and anything that can't be quantified gets ignored or devalued. So creativity becomes about measurable output. Relationships become about networking value. Rest becomes about recovery metrics. Play becomes about skill development. And gradually, all the aspects of human experience that make life meaningful but can't be optimized start to disappear from people's lives. This is how disciplinary power creates what Foucault called subjectification, the process by which people learn to see themselves as subjects to be improved, rather than human beings to be lived. And once you start seeing yourself as a project to be optimized, you lose touch with the spontaneous, unmeasurable, inefficient aspects of human experience that actually create meaning, joy, and satisfaction. You become trapped in an endless loop of self-improvement that never delivers the fulfillment it promises. Because fulfillment isn't something you can optimize your way to. The burnout epidemic is essentially what happens when this process reaches its breaking point. When people have internalized disciplinary power so completely that they stop optimizing themselves, even when it is destroying their mental and physical health. They feel guilty for resting anxious when they're not being productive, and ashamed when they can't maintain the performance standards they've imposed on themselves. And the cruel irony is that the more burned out they get, the more they tend to blame themselves for not being disciplined enough, not having enough willpower, not following the right optimization strategies. Foucault would recognize this self-blame as the perfect expression of disciplinary power, because it makes people responsible for their own suffering, while keeping the system that creates that suffering completely invisible. If you're burned out, it's because you haven't found the right productivity method. If you're anxious, it's because you haven't optimized your mindfulness practice. If you're exhausted, it's because you haven't mastered your energy management. The system never gets questioned because it's designed to make you question yourself instead. But Foucault didn't just diagnose these problems, he also pointed toward ways of understanding and potentially resisting them. Because once you can see how disciplinary power works, once you can recognize the mechanisms by which you've been trained to police yourself, you can start to make different choices, not easy choices. Because the system is designed to make resistance difficult, but possible choices nonetheless. The first step in resisting disciplinary power is what Foucault called genealogy, the process of tracing back the history of ideas, practices, and institutions to show that they're not natural or inevitable, but constructed and contingent. When you realize that productivity culture isn't a natural human drive, but a historically specific way of organizing human behavior that serves particular interests, you can start to question whether those interests align with your own well-being and flourishing. This means looking critically at the productivity advice you consume, the optimization tools you use, and the metrics you've chosen to measure your life by, and asking yourself not whether these things make you more efficient, but whether they make you more human, more connected, more alive, more capable of experiencing the full range of human possibilities. And often the answer is no. They make you more machine-like, more predictable, more manageable, but not more human. Foucault also pointed toward the importance of what he called practices of the self. Ways of relating to yourself that resist the disciplinary tendency to turn you into an object to be optimized. These might include practices like contemplation without goals, creativity without metrics, rest without productivity justification, relationships without networking value, and play without skill development. Essentially, activities that exist for their own sake rather than as means to some optimized end. The challenge is that our entire culture is organized around instrumental thinking, around treating everything as a means to some other end. So even resistance practices can get co-opted by the optimization mindset. Meditation becomes a productivity tool, exercise becomes about performance, metrics, hobbies become side hustles, relationships become personal branding opportunities, even rest gets turned into a strategy for better performance rather than an intrinsic human need. This is why Foucault emphasized the importance of developing what he called an ethics of the self, a way of relating to yourself that prioritizes your own flourishing over your conformity to external standards. But this ethics can't be another set of rules or principles to follow, because that would just be another disciplinary mechanism. Instead, it has to be an ongoing practice of paying attention to your actual experience, your actual needs, your actual desires, rather than the optimized versions of these things that disciplinary power encourages you to pursue. One of the most radical things you can do in our productivity-obsessed culture is to deliberately choose inefficiency. To do things that serve no purpose other than your own enjoyment or curiosity. To waste time intentionally. To resist the constant pressure to justify your existence through measurable achievements. This isn't laziness or self-indulgence. It's a form of resistance to a system that profits from your dissatisfaction and exhaustion. Foucault also understood that resistance couldn't be purely individual, because disciplinary power is a social phenomenon that requires collective response. This means creating communities, relationships, and social spaces that operate according to different values than optimization and efficiency spaces, where people can exist without having to perform or prove their worth, where rest is valued, where inefficiency is celebrated, where human messiness and contradiction are welcomed rather than problems to be solved. This is particularly important in our digital age, where social media platforms function as disciplinary mechanisms that encourage constant self-presentation, comparison, and optimization, creating alternative spaces, whether online or offline, where people can relate to each other as human beings rather than personal brands, becomes a form of political resistance to the systems that are making us sick. The deeper insight in Foucault's work is that disciplinary power doesn't just control our behavior, it shapes our desires, our sense of what's possible, our understanding of what it means to be human. And this is why individual resistance, while important, isn't sufficient. We need to collectively imagine and create different ways of organizing human life, different metrics for success, different understandings of what makes existence worthwhile. This might mean communities that prioritize care over productivity, economies that value well-being over efficiency, technologies that support human flourishing rather than extracting value from human attention, and data educational systems that cultivate wisdom rather than just optimizing test scores, workplaces that treat people as human beings rather than human resources to be managed and optimized. The burnout epidemic isn't just a personal problem that individuals need to solve with better self-care strategies. It's a social problem that requires collective solutions, and Foucault's analysis helps us understand why individual solutions often fail. because they're trying to address the symptoms while leaving the underlying disciplinary apparatus intact. It's like trying to cure someone of a disease while keeping them in the environment that's making them sick. But recognizing this doesn't mean we're powerless. It means we need to be smarter about resistance, more strategic about how we protect our humanity in a system designed to optimize it away, more intentional about creating spaces and relationships that operate according to different values than the ones that dominate our culture, and more committed to the slow, difficult work of learning to relate to ourselves and each other in ways that disciplinary power can't easily co-opt or control. Foucault's warning about disciplinary power is ultimately a warning about what we lose when we let ourselves be reduced to objects to be optimized, rather than subjects to be lived, and the burnout epidemic is just the most visible symptom of that loss. But his work also points toward possibilities for resistance, for different ways of being human, for practices and relationships and communities that prioritize flourishing over efficiency, meaning over metrics, and humanity over optimization. The question isn't whether you can be more productive, more optimized, more efficient. The question is whether you can be more human, more alive, more connected to the aspects of existence that make life worth living, but can't be measured, tracked, or optimized. And that question, Foucault would argue, is not just personal, but political. Not just individual, but collective. Not just about how you manage your time, but about what kind of world we want to create together. This is why understanding Foucault's analysis of disciplinary power isn't just an academic exercise, it's an essential tool for anyone who wants to resist the systems that are making us sick, exhausted, and disconnected from our own humanity. And while the solutions aren't simple or easy, the first step is always the same: learning to see the mechanisms by which you've been trained to police yourself, and choosing moment by moment, day by day, to relate to yourself and others in ways that prioritize human flourishing over systemic efficiency. The productivity era promised us control, optimization, and efficiency. But what it delivered was anxiety, burnout, and alienation. And Foucault's work helps us understand why this was inevitable. Not because individual people are weak or lazy, but because the system was designed to extract value from human insecurity and dissatisfaction. And the only way to truly address burnout isn't to optimize our way out of it, but to question the entire framework that created it in the first place. And that questioning, that resistance, that refusal to be reduced to a productivity machine, is perhaps the most human thing you can do in an age that's forgotten what it means to be human.